Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to join us this evening for History Club. And this evening, we're delighted to be talking with Kim Walsh, who is a member of Christians in Pride. And Kim's going to give us a wee overview of that group. And we're going to talk about LGBTQIA plus inclusive faith groups. Kim, thank you so much for agreeing to come on board with History Club for us this evening.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's a real delight to be here, and lovely to have seen some names and faces of people that I know. Yeah, I'm really, really pleased to be able to have an opportunity to speak to this. I think I wanted to start, although I have a presentation and Joe is kindly going to share that for us. I think I wanted to start a little bit about who I am and why I'm probably quite passionate about this whole idea of inclusive faith spaces. Um, I would describe myself as a cisgender gay Christian. I think I think I've lived in Belfast for about 15 years, but I've been involved with quite a lot of different activities, both within the LGBTQIA plus community and amongst those who are LGBTQIA plus and Christian faith communities. Till recently, I was a member of Rainbow's Board, for the last 9 years. I've also been involved with leading the Spectrum LGBTQI plus Christian Fellowship, as well as being the co-convener of Christians at Pride. And I will say a little bit more about Christians at Pride. I think for me, it took me quite a long time for myself as both a Christian and a gay woman to reconcile my faith and my sexuality. And I'll probably touch on that a little bit as I go through the presentation. And since being here in Northern Ireland, I've been involved with a number of conversations with different churches, primarily though the Presbyterian Church and those of us who have been part of the gay community. I haven't been involved in any conversations that have involved trans people, but I think I would say about the conversations that I was involved with, that there appeared at the time to be quite respectful listening from different groups of people. However, sadly, I think particularly with the Presbyterian Church in 2018, when they made their decision to very explicitly exclude people who were in same-sex partnerships and also refuse baptism to children of people who were in same-sex partnerships, and also their questioning of the legitimacy of the faith of those of us who are gay. I think that left me with a situation where I thought I can no longer continue with these conversations. And at the time, I was actually attending a Presbyterian church. So I think since then, I've felt very motivated, I think, to be able to have more and more conversations with different people in different churches about how there are different views on all of this, and that actually inclusion, well, I certainly would believe is the right way to go. I appreciate some people don't agree with that, and I can understand where people have got very strongly held views from their own faith. But I think there is an alternative, and I'm very keen that we communicate that both to people of faith, but also to people of faith who are LGBTQIA plus. So I hope tonight just really to cover a little bit about the inclusive faith communities that do exist in Northern Ireland. I mean, there are probably significantly more over in GB, and there are some in the Republic, but particularly tonight I want to talk about what's happening here. I think it's really interesting in Northern Ireland that approximately 1 in 3 people would attend church at least once a month. So there's a significant faith interest here. And as part of that, there will be a number of us, like myself, who will be part of the LGBTQIA plus community. So I wonder, Joe, if you would mind just sharing a little bit, share up the first slide that's there.
Okay, so just let me know when you want the next slide.
Yeah. If you can go to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so why do I think this is an important topic, or why do I think inclusive faith spaces are important? And I was just touching on that in terms of my own story, is that I think that because there is such a church going community within Northern Ireland, and there will be a significant number of people who belong to the LGBTQIA plus community who are part of that constituency. And because of the messaging that tends to come from the predominance of churches, which is really, you sort of get on one hand, God loves you, but on the other side, you get, but only if this is the case. So it's almost like, yes, you can be who you are as long as you fit within our box of what that means. And I think for a lot of people who are LGBTQI+, there literally is only two options. There is one option to remain within their faith community, either basically returning back into a closet and not acknowledging who they are, basically having to hide themselves, basically having to make up stories to fit a narrative that's being communicated up the front. And for a lot of people, that will involve significant mental harm. There will be those who would admit to saying they perhaps have struggles with being LGBTQIA+, and then unfortunately they would then be usually dealt with in terms of potentially conversion therapy, or at least people praying that they would manage their issue or their particular struggle. And so I think you have one group of people who really want to see their faith as something that can be very much part of their ongoing life, but who basically either hide themselves away or allow themselves almost to be fixed, which is a horrendous scenario. Or you have a second group of people who basically think, I am not prepared to put myself through this, and who leave the church, who leave their faith, who no longer believe that there is a God who loves them, has made them as they are, who delights in them, and basically leaves that scenario completely, often very disillusioned and in different ways very much harmed. So I think for me, that forcing to choose between faith and identity, whatever the outcome is, I believe causes significant harm to individuals. I also believe that the churches lose out in all of that as well, because there is significant gifting, significant talent that basically is forced out. So I think the idea of having inclusive faith spaces where actually you can be who you are, and you can be who you are openly, that you can be celebrated for that, you can take full part in a church and a congregational setting, and in that sense you reconcile faith and sexuality. I think inclusive faith spaces are important because they're the places that say, come here, we welcome you. We not only welcome you, we need you, and we want to celebrate you. I think the other point about why this is an important topic is that churches still in Northern Ireland still have significant influence in civic society, and although I think it potentially is waning, there politically and certainly in society there can still be significant influence by churches. But the assumption is that all churches think the same, and in reality that is not the case. And inclusive faith spaces, and those that are openly, they are, for those churches that say they are openly LGBTQIA plus affirming, I think offer a different narrative and basically say, this is not true. It is not just one voice. And probably all of us are aware at times how the press can sort of basically say there's Christians on one side and there's members of the community on the other side. And I think inclusive faith spaces say that is not true. There is an alternative narrative here, and there are alternative groups of Christians who believe something completely different to what is ordinarily put forward. So I think this is why it is such an important area that needs to be discussed and needs to be promoted. So what is an inclusive faith space? In essence, and this would be a definition that comes from a website called inclusivefaith.lgbt, and I'll say a little bit more about that site as we go on. But in essence, an inclusive faith space, and I am talking about Christian faith spaces here. I don't know too much about other religious faith spaces, but I would imagine that the definition would not be too different if that were the case. But it's basically a place that LGBTQI plus people can call a spiritual home, whether that's people who are individuals, whether that's people who are couples, whether that's families, but a place where people will be safe, where they will be truly welcomed without qualification, where they will be affirmed and where we will be celebrated. And it's a place where we can fully participate in the life of that congregation or that faith group. So whether that is being able to be baptized, whether it's being able to become members, whether it's being able to take communion, whether it's to be able to participate in the full range of leadership roles. So an inclusive faith space, we would be really saying is, you are like anybody else. And at one point, one would really hope that we no longer have to say that a group is an inclusive faith space, because at some point, I suppose the vision and the hope is that actually all faith spaces will by default be inclusive. Whereas at the moment, sadly, although most churches and Christian groups would probably have a sign outside its door saying all are welcome, unfortunately, that often means all are welcome if, and then there will be a set of criteria that one would be expected to meet, certainly for those of us who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community. But one of the things we ask as part of inclusive faith, before we put a list people on a list of churches or community groups where they are described as inclusive faith, we ask churches and groups to sign up to this, to those two comments, so that somebody comes across that church's name, they will see that they will know that they have committed to this, and that they will also have put a public statement on their own website or Facebook page. It won't just be a case of anybody will be able to be up on that list. And there are churches that I would know that I would describe probably as being inclusive myself, but who are not yet ready to sign that statement or to be very open about being inclusive. And if I'm honest, I find that really hard, because I would want to see as many as possible who make that statement. But there are a number of reasons why people are not doing that. But increasingly, we are having additional churches actually put their names to these statements. And personally, I think it's really important that there is a statement, because I think it does communicate very powerfully to anybody who is LGBTQIA plus, who's looking for a safe faith space. But also I think it communicates really loudly to the general public and to the wider church community that, again, there is this alternative narrative from that which is often portrayed as being the norm. So please, can you go to the next slide? So this is just a map really of where they are. There aren't many inclusive faith spaces who have come out and said that they would sign up to those commitments. But you can see that there are a few around Northern Ireland in terms of places, and they're not all the same. Some of these are actual churches of a range of denominations. Some of them are Christian groups. Some of them would tend to meet fairly frequently. So particularly if they're a church, they'd obviously meet most weeks. Some will just run conferences. Some would meet monthly. Some would meet bi-monthly. It is still very Belfast centric, and I think that is one of the challenging things for us in terms of how we move some of this forward, because although I've mentioned Ballycastle there and Castledurg, I mean, one of them meets once a month and the other one holds conferences occasionally, although their other events would also be inclusive. But you can see there's nothing around the sort of Derry area. And as for I think that's like Oma, that sort of way, there isn't an awful lot there. So I think we would hope that there would be more. So just even in saying this, if anybody is aware of any congregations or faith groups that are within Northern Ireland that they don't see identified on this map, it would be really helpful to hear from you, to let us know, because we don't just, as I say, we wouldn't just add somebody to the list. We would want to explore that with whoever it is, but it would be great if there were others over in the west of Northern Ireland. There are others who meet online for a group, for example, a group called Diverse Church. There are others in the Republic of Ireland, and there are others, obviously, in the wider UK. And there is a list of them that can be found in that link that's at the bottom of the page there. And the site inclusivefaith.lgbt will have that list there. Can you move to the next slide? Okay. So I've commented on this a little bit when I've been saying about the inclusive faith spaces. There are a small number, but it is growing. And I think over time, the number will just increase. There is no mainstream denomination that has come out explicitly supporting LGBTQIA plus inclusion. Probably the nearest is the Quakers, who have allowed their different congregations to make that choice. None of the other denominations, mainstream denominations here, has done that. But there are individual congregations of churches who are inclusive. And I think one of the good things for those that are that is the visibility that they give to their support of the LGBTQI plus community. So some of you will be aware of All Souls in Elmwood Avenue, and I've put an image there of their community carols. I'm putting that there because obviously it's nearly that time of year, but they do have what is a fantastic inclusive LGBT carol service that is going to be held on the 18th of December. I hope I've got that date right. It's certainly on their Facebook page. They also run a Pride service, and there are other churches. St. Christopher's, for example, also runs a Pride service. Ida Hobbit services, St. George's would tend to do that. So one of the things I suppose I'm trying to highlight there is these churches, by doing something very specific and special, are really nailing their colours to the mast, but it's also just letting the wider community, both general community and the LGBTQI plus community, that actually these churches really mean business when they are saying they are an affirming congregation. You'll see there that I've also put things down like running courses. There are a number of churches that have run courses for people to be thinking through, what does the Bible say? What does our faith say about sexuality or about gender? And then various churches have also been involved with campaigning. So Changing Attitude Ireland, who are probably one of the earliest groups in terms of campaigning. St. George's has been involved with supporting them. You'll see a picture down the bottom right there of Steve Ames from Harbour Church in Carrickfergus, and the statement behind him about affirming same-sex marriage. So I think where churches, and that table was there at Pride. So I think as increasingly churches and other Christian groups start to actually put out statements or start to hold things, I think it starts to communicate to the wider public there isn't just one story around this, that there is a broader narrative and different perspectives. I've mentioned below there about campaigning and umbrella initiatives. There are a number of denominational groups, although mainstream denominations are not supportive of the wider inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people of faith. There are denominational groups that are trying to change the narrative within their own denomination. So, for example, I mentioned Changing Attitude Ireland in terms of the Church of Ireland, accepting sexuality within the Methodist Church, being Presbyterian within the Presbyterian Church. And I'm sure there are others that I may not necessarily be aware of. I've included two other initiatives there that I will say a little bit more about in a moment. Christians at Pride and Inclusive Faith, as I mentioned, as the website. But some of these, just to go back to some of these denominational groups, I mean, there have been people who've been working away there for many years on some of these conversations. Some of you will be aware of Richard O'Leary in terms of having been the previous coordinator of the History Club, and his work, for example, and his partner's work within Changing Attitude Ireland. And actually, if you want to know a little bit more perhaps about sort of the older history of some of the involvement of Christians and LGBTQI plus inclusion, then Richard has done a lovely sort of half an hour talk on the inclusivefaith.lgbt website, where he goes back over back to even the Gay Christian, forgotten what it was called, the Gay Christian Network, the Gay Christian, somebody here will probably be able to correct me on what that group was called, Gay Christian Fellowship, that's what it was, which was quite a long time ago, and those who initially walked in Pride as well. So there is a history before sort of people like me turned up, who we are really building upon. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there have been people working away on this for many, many years. And even though at the moment it may only still seem like a small group, there are more now. And I do personally think there is momentum. I think there is also those who are in opposition to that momentum, but I sometimes think opposition is a good sign that we might be doing the right things, and hope that well, certainly optimistic that there will be growth in that in years to come. So I wanted to talk about a couple of initiatives that have been more recent, and that is Christians at Pride and Inclusive Faith. So I don't know if you wouldn't mind, Joe, playing the video for Christians at Pride, if that's okay, and then we'll go to the slide on that.
Christians at Pride is an informal network of Christians from many denominations across Northern Ireland. We are members of the LGBTQ plus community, friends, allies, and representatives from inclusive churches and faith spaces. We have been taking part in Pride parades since 2017, and we aim to bring a joyful, loving, and affirming Christian presence to Northern Ireland prides. All are welcome to join us as we walk together. We believe God loves, welcomes, and affirms all people equally, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, and we want to share this love and welcome as we walk in Pride. We have a Facebook page, Christians at Pride NI, where we share information about events, news, and promote LGBTQ plus inclusive churches and faith-based groups. Do get in touch if you'd like to find out more.
Okay. Thank you. That is a little promotional video that we put out, just really to explain a little bit about what Christians at Pride is. As you heard there, we've been going since 2017, and it was really the brainchild of Judith Dazelle, who I work with, Christians at Pride, and there's others who were involved with this earlier on. I'm deliberately not giving names out here because I'm not sure exactly whether people will be happy for their names to be publicised everywhere. So names I'm given, I'm fairly sure people are comfortable with them going out. But just to say once again, there've been other people who've been very much involved in this prior to my involvement. But one of the things that I think has been a real aim with Christians at Pride has been to offer this different narrative at Pride, because those of you who've ever walked in Belfast Pride, or actually have ever just visited Belfast Pride, you'll know that there is a bunch of Christian protesters that usually stand outside the city hall, and really with very derogatory, disrespectful, in no way can be described as loving statements being put on their placards. And I think what we are wanting to say is not only do we disagree with the theology of those individuals, is that actually we want to communicate a much more positive story. The God that we want to follow communicates a very different message, and that is a God who loves people, who celebrates people, who doesn't make mistakes with people. And we've been very fortunate in that, that we've been able to get to a number of different prides around Northern Ireland. Belfast is by far our biggest pride, and in fact I think it was last year, so I think 2023, I think we had about 70 people walking with us. And I think when you see that number of people who say they are Christian walking in pride and affirming God's love, it's a completely different message to the handful of protesters who are standing down behind by the city hall. So this year we also went to Causeway, so for its first Pride parade, and that was just delightful. And again, I think we have a number of times been asked by organisers to take part in prides, and I think that says something about what is happening, both in terms of the relationships that we have with Pride organisers and hopefully the wider LGBTQIA plus community. We often also take part in the Pride Village, or the equivalent of Pride Village, and you'll see a little image down the bottom left there, well, it's on the right hand side, but to the left, of Ian and June Carton, who are part of a group called Proud Parents, and who basically create gifts that communicate you are wonderfully made, I think is their strap line, and who offer basically mum and dad hugs to anybody who wants them, regardless of who people are. And I think, again, the sort of conversations that they have with people on a one-to-one basis, I think significantly aims to communicate that the God that we follow does love people and wants the best people, wants people to be the best who they can be and to thrive. So I think we've seen Pride really as a protest to say that, there are different views on this, and we have a different view to often what is sort of promoted as the mainstream view, that we affirm LGBTQIA plus people, and that we celebrate LGBTQIA plus people, which is quite weird for me to say, given I am a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, but I think that's our aim, and I think we see that when we walk, the difference when people don't realise to perhaps what people have heard from others. I've included in here, and Joey's going to have another attempt here at sharing another video, which is Michael, who also had been a volunteer of the History Club, but he described his experience of walking in Pride for the first time, and I think it powerfully communicates what it's like for those of us who've been part of Christians at Pride, walking in Pride, but also that sort of understanding of why we think it is important. So, Joe, if you're happy to try and share Michael's video, and I have had permission from Michael to share this video.
Great. Okay.
On Saturday, the 3rd of August, 2019, I walked in the Belfast Pride Parade for the first time. It was a bit of a rainy, overcast morning, and as I walked to the meeting point before the parade to join with the Christians at Pride Group outside St George's Church in High Street, it's probably fair to say that the weather wasn't the only thing that was making me nervous about taking part that day. I've never been a great one for taking part in public demonstrations. In fact, the last time I can remember walking in any kind of parade was in a Boys Brigade parade on the York Road back in the mists of time in the 1990s, just a little bit different from the Pride Parade. And to be honest, even just a week before, I had been having second thoughts about whether I should go or not. I usually work on the first Saturday of every month, and I was almost ready to use that as an excuse for missing the parade when my boss, who knew that I was intending to go, very kindly offered to cover for me that Saturday. Then I thought, okay, well, I'll go and I'll walk in the parade with the Christians at Pride Group, many of whom are my friends. But Because it's my first Pride, I'll blend in. I won't stick out too much. Well, don't ask me how it happened, but by the time we left St. George's to join with the other groups in the parade, I had my purple Christians at Pride t-shirt on. I had rainbows painted on my face, and I had my Christians at Pride placard, which, as it turned out, was quite a handy substitute for an umbrella for the rest of the day. Well, any chance of blending into the crowd finally disappeared when we found out that when we joined the groups, we were actually going to be at the very front of the groups in the parade, standing beside the Albert clock as we gathered together, waiting to move off, with groups from All Souls Church and Spectrum. We were soon joined by the Lord Mayor of Belfast and then by the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar of all people. The camera snapped, and the image of my face on the front page of the Belfast Telegraph soon entered my mind. But then I was reminded of something obvious about Pride. So many of us, if we are LGBT people and from a faith background, have been shamed. We've been made to feel like our stories don't matter, that we don't belong, and that we should just hide ourselves away. And standing with my friends that afternoon in the centre of Belfast, I realised in that moment that I didn't have to hide myself away, that I did belong, and that there was a place for me there, both as a member of the LGBT community and as a person of faith. So as the parade began to move off, and as we started down High Street at the head of the groups, carrying our banners and waving our placards proclaiming God's love and welcome, I genuinely felt like all my reservations about being there just melted away. I couldn't believe the crowds of people packed onto the pavements, and the sound of the cheering was just amazing. In fact, there were times when I was thinking this must be what it feels like to work for Disney and walk in one of their parades. But I think there was also a recognition in so many of the crowd that day that there was something really important about our being there as LGBT people, as family members, as friends, as allies, and also as people of faith. We may have been only able to carry a handful of placards to represent the small number of affirming churches in Belfast, but we were there, walking together, and in our footsteps proclaiming something about God's love for our city and for all of its people.
Thanks, Joe. If you can pop back to the presentation, that would be great. So I hope you enjoyed that story. I think one of the things that we are keen on, both Christians at Pride and in terms of inclusive faith, is the power of storytelling. And yourselves as the History Club, I know you have collected stories, and I think there's something really significant about the experience, the lived experience of individuals to challenge what is often seen as the sort of commonly held views. And I think we know that generally speaking, it tends to be it's going to be somebody's lived experience, somebody's relationship with somebody else that will challenge people's perceptions and challenge and change people's beliefs. It's very rare, in my experience, that somebody changes their views that they may have held really strongly for many years on inclusion of LGBTQI plus inclusion by going to the Bible and starting there. Ordinarily, it's because somebody has met someone who's part of the LGBTQI plus community and is someone of faith and has seen how that is lived out in everyday experience, which has then challenged people's often very, very long held views and has sent them back then looking at the Bible to look at potential different interpretations and different views. And I think often that's when change occurs. So I think part of Christians at Pride is, again, to be able to say, look, we are here. We don't hold the view of many mainstream churches, but also I think it and I think Michael was alluding to this in his story, is to be able to say, and I think I've mentioned this a few times tonight, that God loves people. And one of the things I would say about the times I've walked in Pride have been the number of people who have been quite emotionally affected by the fact that we are walking there. The number of people at times who've come up to us afterwards and have thanked us for being there because either they or a member of their family has been hurt by the prevailing narrative within the faith community. And although I think there's a growing number of people who are questioning the traditionally held perspectives, I don't think people are always aware of the impact it has on others who are either people who are LGBTQI plus themselves or have family members. And I think what we aim to do at Christians at Pride is to really offer that alternative. I would say that visibility and education are probably the two main things that we would like to see happen. And I think if you can move to the next slide there, Joe, inclusivefaith.lgbt is this website. This was launched in February 2023, so I suppose it's not quite 2 years old. It was a passion project really with Kirsten Kearney and from ESE Films and Podrigo Tuma, who was leader of the Corrymeela community at that time, of having a website, a place that would be really a resource both for people who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community of faith to find safe places, but also an educational resource for the wider Christian church and for those who may be actually asking questions about the lived experience of LGBTQI plus people and their faith. So it provides a range of resources. And if you can just go to the next slide, Joe, that would be great. So you can see there, you can probably just see in some of those images, but basically this site includes stories of those who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, those who are allies, those who are ministers of the Christian faith, and how they have come to change their perspectives to become ministers who would advocate for inclusion. There are also sermons and talks really outlining how, as a Christian, you can believe this alternative viewpoint, because there are a lot of people who would argue against that. And I think they're trying to provide resources which would enable Christians who are accepting in terms of inclusion to be able to strengthen their understanding of that and to be able to deal with any conversations of challenge. There's also details of affirming churches and groups and faith spaces, which is what I was referring to earlier with the map. And some of those are outside of Northern Ireland too. And then there is information also on the sort of the community LGBTQIA plus community groups. In fact, I think the History Project may even be noted there. And if it isn't, we should definitely be adding it, I think. So as a site, we would ideally want this to be something that it becomes well known. We believe it is a site that can be trusted. We believe it is a site that can influence. And as I was saying earlier, people are influenced by stories, but it is very, as you know yourselves, it's very costly to tell your story to people. Each time we almost feel like we're having to defend ourselves, defend who we are, defend who our perceptive, sort of our particular beliefs are. And I think one of the things that's good about this site is it has recorded videos of people, some that are very open and you see the faces of people and their names, others where you just hear something of their voices. But the idea is that people could go there and hear some of these stories, and it wouldn't cost those of us who've given it any more than the original video that we would have had taken of ourselves. There are also courses there. There's a particular course, a question of belonging, where there are some questions, again, to try and get people to think about some of the issues related here in terms of what the Bible says, how can churches be affirming, What does that look like? What does that mean? And there's a list of other courses for other groups. And so we want it to be a resource that where people are on a journey towards inclusion, that they can come and find out more information in a safe way for them as well, because many people who perhaps are questioning and exploring, who themselves may not be part of the LGBTQI plus community, are equally unable often to ask those questions within their faith community. As I say, I am hopeful for the future. I do think the tide of history will prove that inclusion is the way to go. But I think it will take a long time to get there. But by small steps, there is change. And I think, yes, I've been encouraged by some of the conversations I have had with people recently. But there is also a lot of opposition, as you are well aware. So I think I'm probably going to stop there. That is my last slide. I think one thing I suppose I would like to ask of yourselves here is really one, how might we best, I suppose, be able to advertise something like the inclusivefaith.lgbt site to the wider LGBTQI plus community, and also perhaps how can those of us who are part of the LGBTQI plus community, people of faith, how can we engage better with the wider sector? Because sometimes there can feel like there's divisions even within our sector, and I think we would want to build bridges there. I think we all want to see that change happening within communities of faith. So if you do have any thoughts on that, I would be interested in that even now as part of the discussion. But if not now, certainly at another time, and you're very welcome to contact me at any point. So Joe, back to you. Thank you.
Wonderful, Kim. Thank you so much. That was very informative, and loved hearing that. Particularly the parents who were giving mommy and daddy hugs. I got a wee bit choked up at hearing about that. I thought that was so lovely. Particularly for people who have been maybe rejected by their family because of the conflict between belief and sexual orientation or gender identity. I think that's a really great way for the organisations to reach out. Gareth, did you have a question, or Will?
Do you have a question, Will?
I was just going to say that sometimes we talk about people of within congregations and churches hiding their sexuality, their sexual their gender identity, but that works backwards as well. There are people within the LGBTQIA plus A community who are hiding their Christian identity because they feel that makes them the enemy.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's partly why I was asking the question at the end there. How do we build some of those bridges? I have found that, like I say, I sat on the board of Rainbow for 9 years, and there were other Christian members of that board. And I think it's as you get to know each other, I think that can make a huge difference. And I think there's something about those of us who are Christian that it's important to get involved in the wider community, because I think that can help break down some of those barriers. But it's also a challenge, I think, to the LGBTQI plus community of being willing to hear that people can be both those things. So absolutely, I agree. Yeah, would you have any suggestions of how that might be challenged?
Well, no, I was just going to say, well, I'm involved with Queerspace, and there are a number of people with strong faith that go along. I would like to hope that everybody can be themselves, but I think it would be good to maybe suggest doing some events in the LGBT Centre. The website signposting, like all the community groups there should be signposting, without, but I mean already if not. So I think maybe I don't know, maybe try to centre some activities centre. I know there's opportunities when the centre relocates as well, so there's bound to be sort of doors open there. So I'd like to hope that sort of integrate some activities, religious activity, into the community base as such.
That's a good idea, I think. I know there had been some conversations, I think possibly pre-COVID, about the potential of doing something. So I think it's trying to follow up on that. But that's a good idea, especially with the new centre, because there would hopefully be space. So,
but even like to be, it doesn't have to, like, it could be debates, it could be discussions, it could be history talks, it could be just fellowship.
Yes, no, I agree. Yeah, no, it's
a lot of
the
history of gays within the faith community as well.
Mm. Yes, I say Richard O'Leary certainly has got a very interesting. Well, I'm sure you've all heard Richard tell stories at some point, which are of great delight to most of us. So,
regardless of his topic.
Yes, yes.
But on faith, he is quite an effective speaker.
Yeah, and there are others who I think would be happy to do that as well. And I think it may well be there's almost something like I don't know if because it's copyrighted, but like 10 by 9, but where you could have a mixture of people talking about things which isn't necessarily, it's not a religious service and it's not pushing anything at anybody, but it's just the sharing of life experience. So that's a good idea. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's just about engagement, Kim, and reaching out to organisations and asking them to maybe put a wee advert on their social media for if you're having any events, just to invite specific organisations along and ask them to share it with the groups that they're working with.
Yeah,
I think most wouldn't have an issue with it. It's just growing up when you first come out, there's a lot of stereotypes around. Christians being a natural enemy of the LGBT people would be one of those kind of stereotypes, things that you grow up believing. Also, when I was only out, I was informed that gay men and lesbians weren't friends. They didn't get on.
I thought we were supposed to be enemies as well.
Yes.
Or is that frenemies?
Frenemies.
Should I go now?
I have an expression that I'm sure some of you have heard. Love the sinner but hate the sin.
Yes.
I don't know that people have the intelligence or the intellect to manage that kind of loving the sinner but hating the sin. That's a hard thing to juggle.
Yeah.
And it's many years ago, I came out to my brother, who's a clergyman. He was the Church of Ireland clergyman, and I was quite upset. And once he realised what I was trying to tell him, he says, "Oh, thank God! I thought you were going to tell me something. You're trying to tell me something was wrong with you." It was very, very positive.
Well, I like that response. I think that's a very good response. So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Christianity should be about.
Exactly. I agree. And I actually think that is what it is about.
The idea of promoting inclusive churches. I mean, how can you be a church and not be inclusive?
Yeah.
Well,
I think
there are some very strongly held views where I mean, I am currently doing a master's in theology at the moment, and my area of interest is looking at ethical biblical interpretation. And I think
even that's a dangerous word when you get around fundamentalist.
Well, exactly.
One doesn't interpret the Bible. It should be obvious to everybody.
Exactly. No, I think that, and that's the issue, is that people come at things with obviously very strongly held presuppositions. And I think it's how do we have conversations with people, some of whom I do believe are questioning when they sort of think, well, the harm we are doing to people, but I haven't got a framework or haven't got a confidence to be able to think, to look at the Bible for themselves. And I think part of what the inclusivefaith.lgbt site is trying to do is to give people those resources to be able to look at things for themselves. But as you know, it's a very strong sense of belonging within Christian communities, and for a lot of people, they end up totally being ostracized and losing their whole social network at that point. It's incredibly isolating and fearful, and I'm not saying that isn't true for people of the LGBTQIA plus community who aren't people of faith, but I do think that's what holds people there sometimes, and I think we want to give people the opportunity to be able to just to be able to say there are different narratives here that are increasingly being accepted. But it's very difficult if you've come from a very strongly held viewpoint that you've grown up with all your life and your whole of your life is surrounded by. I agree, it's very difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, it could be hard to recover from that. I mean, I remember being in Catholic Mass and around the time of equality, when the age of consent was equalized to 16, and the priest was just going ballistic about what are you going to do when your 16-year-old son brings his boyfriend home, and this was a huge scandal, and I just felt so exposed and hurt by that, and felt that the priest was talking directly to me. But and then I couldn't go back after that. And I think it just takes one thing like that to take away your entire religion, your entire access to spirituality, and that can be so damaging.
I mean, that's tragic, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely tragic. And for others, it leads them. I mean, you seem a very well-adjusted individual. I don't know you that well, but but I mean, the number of people I have met who have self-harmed or whose mental health has been very poor, suicide ideation, just awful situations, and tragically, people have taken their own lives, and you just sort of think, this cannot be right. This cannot be right.
But people don't realize the impact of their words. I mean, when Iris Robinson was on the Stephen Nolan show, and she was talking about psychiatrists, and she could think of nothing worse, that was really, really damaging to the community, I feel, because there was a feeling that she was voicing a mainstream view from Christianity, and she was not afraid to say what she said, and it was very impactful. And I think it took a long time for the community. Probably some people haven't recovered from that. I know myself, I had to do some self-reflection and self-help work around that time, which ultimately I'm grateful for. But it's very damaging.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really important that Christians who are able, who are for LGBTQIA plus inclusion, are willing to be public about it, to go on the airways, to be part of debates, who are Steve Ames from Harbour and Chris Hudson, both of them have been great at being willing to give their opinions publicly, but it costs them, and it costs their churches. I mean, anybody who was at the Pride service at All Souls this year, I mean, there were protesters outside on the other side of the road, basically giving a completely different message, totally contrary to the message of love that was going on inside the church, was happening outside the church, and it's costly for that congregation. But I mean, they are willing to pay that, and for that, I'm very grateful. Those straight allies that are willing to put their voices and their faces out there, I think, really just very brave of them, because it's very costly for them as well. But we do need more. I think there needs to be more if we're going to see change happen anytime soon. Especially I think amongst some of the denominations where they are becoming more conservative or more entrenched. So, I mean, as I alluded to or mentioned, the PCI decision in 2018, and, you know, the fact that they questioned the faith of LGBTQI plus people. You know, when you start a credible profession of faith, you go, actually, who are you to judge my faith? You know, and actually, what about your faith? You know, now I don't want to be I don't want to be hypocritical and start criticizing them, but I think it's the fact that there was almost a sort of dismissiveness of you can't be LGBTQI plus and be a person of faith. And I sort of think, well, I really don't believe that. And a lot of people have heard the stories of people who are LGBTQI plus don't believe that. And I think that's why it's important for our stories to get out there, because I think it is often, as mentioned earlier, it's our lived lives that demonstrate a completely different message. But it is really costly and it is really painful, as you will all know. You know, when we share our stories and people reject us or question us, you know, there's always that sort of price that we pay. But I think it's really important that those of us who are able, and I'm not saying that should be true of everybody, because I wouldn't want anybody to be forced into that situation, but for those of us who are able to put our heads above the parapet of it and have some of those conversations, I think it's really important to do so. But I mean, I would be aware of a number of people who just get worn out with this sort of advocacy and campaigning. You know, every time, I know myself, when I've shared in services or had been part of sort of living library type exercises, you know, we're sharing something that's very vulnerable about who we are, and you know, you're waiting for the judgment to come, and that's not healthy, and you know, is not easy in the long run to sustain. And I think we've seen that with some of the inclusive faith Christian groups, where, you know, we haven't been able to maintain the number of volunteers from the LGBTQI plus Christian side of things, because actually it's just been too costly for people, and sometimes people just need a break, but there aren't necessarily people coming up from within the ranks to fill those spaces. So yeah, so it's not easy at all.
Yeah, and as Will says there, it can be a case of coming out of one closet into another. When you're in the community, then you hide your faith.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No. Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
And it is good to see the community taking both a spiritual and an intellectual questioning about what damage are we doing to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else have any questions or would like to share anything?
The very idea that there was a denomination who was going to punish same-sex couples by not baptizing and christening their children. That's absolute madness.
Yeah. Yeah, that wasn't very nice at all, hearing about that.
But it was encouraging that there were a number of other people from that denomination who wrote to complain about it, and that there is a group within PCI who is working for change. How successful they will be, I don't know, but it was encouraging that there were people who were prepared to stand up, people who perhaps had never stood up before, starting to do that. But it's a denomination that is continues to hound people, I think, who would be supportive. And whether it will survive in the long run,
challenging their faith for challenging somebody's doctrine.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of faith traditions who expect people to come to their own decisions by reading the Bible. And they don't want it to be necessarily a top-down, we're going to decide what your faith should be. That's your responsibility to read the text and draw your own interpretation. Even that's a dangerous word when you get to fundamentalist. No one interprets. There is no interpretation. Maybe understanding is a word that would be less provocative.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess what you're saying there is, which I think is quite important, is how do we use language that is understood, because we can use the same words and mean completely different things, and that can mean that we go past each other when we are having those conversations. And I think that's important for those of us who are involved with listening.
Because even sometimes the word church gets confusing. Are we talking about a congregation that meets at a place together? Are we talking about denominations? Are we talking about the body of Christ as a whole, as the church?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way we use church, because people talk about I'm going to church on Sunday. You mean you're going to a building where a congregation meets?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I was first going out with my partner, he thought we were very devout because we were always going to St. Matthew's. And until he realized that it was St. Matthew's Sports and Social Club we were going to. And he was a Protestant, and he thought he was he was raging when he found out he was missing out on all the drinking, and it wasn't.
Yes, a good example of language.
Yeah. Misinterpretation.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else got anything they'd like to say before we wrap up? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening, and for people who are listening and catch up. Hope you enjoy the information, and if you'd like to find out more, just drop us an email, and we'll forward it on to Kim, and or give you the links to the websites that we've been talking about. And thank you all so much for supporting the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project, and we look forward to seeing you on the next History Club.